Raul Mendez entered the upscale restaurant with a calm, unhurried gait. The day had been long. A series of cases, rulings, and the quiet weight of responsibility that never truly left his shoulders. Tonight, however, he was determined to leave it all behind, at least for an hour or two, and indulge in a peaceful meal. Dressed impeccably, Raul exuded a calm confidence that few men carried with such dignity. As he stepped further into the dining area, Raul felt the silence before he saw the stairs. The gentle murmur of conversation lowered ever so slightly, enough that he could feel the change. It was subtle, the kind of chill that only those accustomed to facing it would notice. "Good evening, sir. Do you have a reservation?" The hostess's voice was polite, but her eyes darted around nervously as if seeking confirmation that she should be speaking to him. Raul nodded, a faint, understanding smile playing on his lips. "Yes, under Mendez." Raul Mendez. She looked at him, a flicker of recognition in her gaze. "Of course, right this way." He was led to a table near the back, though he couldn't help but notice the number of empty tables closer to the windows. It was subtle, almost too easy to overlook. But Raul had lived long enough to recognize the patterns, to understand the quiet ways in which barriers were drawn. He took his seat, eyes scanning the room, taking in the glances cast in his direction. Across the room, he noticed a family. The father, a well-dressed man in his mid-50s, gave him a long, uncomfortable stare, then whispered something to his wife. She responded with a shake of her head, glancing at Raul just long enough for him to see the shadow of disdain in her eyes. Raul let his gaze drop, his fingers tapping softly against the table. This wasn't new. The waiter approached, stiff and expressionless, setting down the menu without making eye contact. "Let me know when you're ready to order," he said, his tone brisk, almost dismissive. Raul's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Thank you." He skimmed the menu, consciously relaxing his shoulders. He was here to unwind, not to engage with the ignorance around him. He knew who he was, knew the years of work, discipline, and dedication that had brought him to where he was. He would not let the murmurs or disapproving glances unsettle him. As he waited, two men entered the restaurant, laughing and talking loudly. They wore police uniforms, and Raul felt an instinctive pang of tension. The taller of the two men, whose name tag read Officer Davi, stopped talking as he glanced around the room, his eyes landing on Raul with an amused glint. "Look at that," Davi whispered to his partner. "Officer Morrow," not quite low enough to avoid Raul's ears. "Guy looks a little out of place, don't you think?" Morrow chuckled, nodding in agreement as his gaze followed Davi's. They continued to the bar, but Raul could feel their eyes on him, the laughter that was somehow directed his way even without words. Raul sat straighter, reminding himself of his own dignity. "You're a judge, not a pawn for their amusement," he thought, holding his head high. However, the laughter, the glances, each one was a reminder that no matter his position, no matter his achievements, the perception others held of him was often fixed in prejudice. Minutes later, the two officers walked over, Davi leaning close to Raul's table with a grin that lacked any warmth. "Didn't think we'd be seeing someone like you in a place like this. You, lost?" Raul met Davi's gaze, calm and steady. "Not at all. Just here for a quiet dinner." Davi smirked. "Fancy a judge enjoying the same perks as the rest of us." "You are a judge, aren't you?" Raul held his gaze, unwilling to back down. "That's correct." Davi's smile faded, his expression twisting into something colder. "How about you show us some ID, just for the record?" He straightened, his voice a shade louder, drawing the attention of nearby diners. Raul's hands were steady as he reached into his jacket, pulling out his identification and handing it to Davi without a word. Davi inspected it, a gleam of satisfaction in his eyes as he turned to Morrow. "Look at that," Davi said, raising the ID for everyone to see. "It's legit." "Well, Who would have thought? Raoul's lips tightened, but he kept his composure. This was a game he had played too many times, a bitter dance of pride against the blindness of others. But then Davi spoke again, and this time his voice was darker, more pointed. Even if it's legit, sometimes ID isn't enough. People find ways to, sneak into places they don't belong. Officer Davi, Raoul said, his voice calm but firm. I think that's enough. I'm here as a paying customer, and unless you have an actual concern, I'd appreciate if you'd let me enjoy my meal. Morrow laughed, a low, mocking sound. Oh, we're just being careful, Judge. Can't be too sure these days, can we? At that, Raoul felt a stir of anger, raw and searing. He looked around, seeing the expressions of the other patrons, their discomfort, their satisfaction, their apathy. He knew that each of them would walk away, perhaps telling themselves they hadn't seen or heard anything wrong. But for him, this was more than an uncomfortable moment. It was another brick in a wall he had been fighting all his life. Just as he was about to speak, Gabriella, the restaurant manager, approached, her face a mixture of worry and determination. Officers, is there a problem here? Davi chuckled, waving a dismissive hand. Nothing you'd understand, ma'am. Just a routine check. Gabriella glanced at Raoul, her expression softening with empathy. She turned back to the officers, her voice taking on a firm edge. I'm sorry, but Mr. Mendez is a guest here, a respected guest. If there's no actual issue, I'd appreciate it if you let him enjoy his dinner in peace. Davi hesitated, clearly irritated by the interruption. But Morrow pulled at his sleeve, muttering something under his breath, and after a tense moment, they both walked away. Raoul exhaled slowly, nodding in gratitude at Gabriella. Thank you. She nodded back, her expression strained. I'm sorry. We're not all like that. Raoul offered her a small smile, though his eyes were shadowed with exhaustion. I know, but sometimes it feels like it. Gabriella placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, then turned away, leaving him to his meal. But even as Raoul attempted to return to his dinner, the weight of the encounter lingered, a reminder that his battle was far from over. He watched as the officers settled at the bar, laughing among themselves, casting glances his way. And he knew, with a certainty born of experience, that this was just the beginning. Raoul Mendez sat alone in his office the next day, the humiliation of the previous night pressing heavily on him. Every moment replayed in his mind. The mocking smirks, the look of disdain from the patrons, and, most of all, the feel of cold handcuffs tightening on his wrists. The thoughts stirred anger within him, tempered only by the deep disappointment he'd tried hard to shake. A knock on his office door pulled him out of his thoughts. Judge Mendez? Gabriella's voice was soft, almost hesitant as she stepped inside. He looked up, surprised to see her. Gabriella, I didn't expect. I couldn't just pretend nothing happened. Raoul, she interrupted, her eyes filled with genuine regret. I should have done more last night. I didn't know how. Raoul studied her face, noting the discomfort and guilt etched into her expression. You did what you could, Gabriella. It's more than anyone else tried. She took a seat across from him, her voice barely above a whisper. But it wasn't enough, was it? Watching them, treating you like that. And I just stood there. Raoul shook his head. You don't have to blame yourself for the actions of others. What happened is on those officers, not you. Gabriella swallowed hard, her hands clasped tightly together. I don't want to let it go, Raoul. I've seen things like this happen too many times. This time, I feel like I can't stay silent. Raoul's eyes softened, his guard lowering just a little. Gabriella, silence is what they count on. And I've been quiet for a long time, thinking that respect and achievement would protect me. But you're right. This time, silence isn't enough. Gabriella leaned forward, her voice steady with newfound determination. Then let me help. Whatever it takes, witness statements, speaking to the media, I'll do it. Raul considered her offer, feeling a glimmer of hope. Are you ready for that? It won't be easy. The media can be relentless, and speaking out against the police could affect your job. Her jaw clenched slightly, but her gaze didn't waver. I've seen too many people hurt by staying silent, Raul. I can't be one of them anymore. He nodded slowly, feeling a sense of purpose beginning to rekindle within him. All right then, we're going to file a formal complaint. If they want to fight, we'll give them one, but on our terms. A week later, Raul and Gabriella met with Anthony Chun, a civil rights attorney who had a reputation for taking on high-profile cases involving police misconduct. Anthony listened quietly as Raul recounted the events, his face growing graver with each detail. When Raul finished, Anthony leaned back in his chair. Judge Mendez, I have to be honest with you. Cases like this are uphill battles. The police will likely fight it tooth and nail. Raul nodded. I know. I also know that this isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's been treated like this. I can't let it slide. Anthony looked at Gabriella, his gaze assessing. And you're prepared to testify? She didn't hesitate. Yes, I saw everything. The humiliation, the complete disregard for his rights. I'll tell the truth, whatever it takes. Anthony smiled, a glimmer of admiration in his eyes. All right then, we'll file the complaint and make sure it gets the attention it deserves. But prepare yourselves. The media will latch onto this, and it won't be kind. Raul exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of what lay ahead. I'm ready. It's time people see what happens behind closed doors. As anticipated, the story quickly spread. News outlets picked up on the incident, framing it as yet another instance of racial profiling by the police. Raul found himself at the center of the media storm, with reporters calling day and night, eager for a statement. Late one evening, he received a call from his sister, Camila. Her voice was tight with worry. Raul, I saw the news. You're really going through with this? Yes, Camila. It's long overdue, he replied, pacing the living room as he spoke. But they're going to come after you. You know how they are. They'll dig into everything from your past, every mistake you ever made. Raul paused, understanding her fear. Camila, I've spent my life trying to rise above their judgment, playing by the rules they set. But I can't ignore this anymore. If I don't do something, who will? There was a long silence on the other end, and then she sighed. I just don't want to see you hurt. He softened, feeling the familiar warmth of her concern. I know, but this is something I have to do. For me, for us. Camila's voice wavered. Then I'm with you, Raul. Whatever happens. Days later, Raul found himself in a television studio, sitting across from a well-known journalist who had promised him an honest, fair interview. As the cameras rolled, she leaned forward, a serious expression on her face. Judge Mendez, can you tell us why you decided to take this public? Raul met her gaze, his voice steady. Because what happened to me is part of a larger problem. I want people to understand that no one is exempt from discrimination, no matter their status or title. It's not about me alone. It's about changing a system that devalues people based on appearances. The journalist nodded, her expression softening. Some people might say you're just trying to bring attention to yourself. How would you respond to that? Raul's eyes hardened. Attention was never the goal. Accountability is. And if standing up means people finally pay attention, then so be it. He felt the weight of his words sink in, both in the studio and in his own heart. This was bigger than him. He knew that now. After the interview, Raul was met by Gabriella outside the studio. She was holding a phone, her eyes wide as she looked up at him. Raul, people are responding. The comments online. They're supporting you, rallying behind you. He glanced down at the screen, seeing post after post of support, from people sharing similar experiences to those expressing solidarity with his fight. It's overwhelming, he said, a note of disbelief in his voice. Gabriella placed a hand on his arm. This is what happens when people see someone willing to fight. You're giving them a voice, Raul. He met her gaze, gratitude filling his heart. I couldn't have done this without you, Gabriella. Your support. It's been invaluable. She smiled, a hint of pride in her expression. I just did what anyone with a conscience would do. Raul shook his head. No, you did more than that. You stood by me when it would have been easier to walk away. That means more than you know. They shared a quiet moment, the weight of the battle ahead balanced by the sense of solidarity between them. As the lawsuit moved forward, Raul received a message from one of his former colleagues, Judge Michael Porter, inviting him to meet for coffee. When Raul arrived at the cafe, he found Michael already waiting, his expression serious. Raul, Michael began, clasping his hands together. I wanted to talk to you because, well, there's a lot of talk in the legal circles about what you're doing. Raul raised an eyebrow. Let me guess, they think I'm stirring the pot? Michael hesitated, then nodded. Some do. They think it's risky, especially for someone in your position. But I respect what you're doing. Not many would have the courage. Raul sighed, feeling the pressure of his decision more acutely. Courage or recklessness? Sometimes I can't tell the difference. Michael chuckled, though his eyes were somber. There's a fine line, isn't there? But sometimes you have to cross it to get anywhere worthwhile. Raul looked down at his coffee, considering his words. I've lived my life playing by their rules, Michael. I've waited, hoped that justice would come if I did everything right. But I can't wait anymore. People like me can't afford to wait. Michael's gaze softened. Then keep fighting, Raul. And know that there are people who believe in what you're doing. Raul nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Raul's face was tense as he sat across from the journalist, Angela Perez, who had just asked a question that caught him off guard. They were in the middle of a formal interview when she leaned forward, her eyes sharp with curiosity. Judge Mendez, she began slowly. I've come across something surprising. I believe you once served in law enforcement? Raul froze, 1,000 thoughts racing through his mind. He had buried that chapter of his life for years. It wasn't exactly a secret, but it was a part of his past he rarely discussed, and even fewer people knew about it. Is that correct? She pressed, sensing his hesitation. Before becoming a judge, you were with the police force? Raul took a deep breath, trying to mask his unease. Yes, that was a lifetime ago. Angela leaned in, her tone more intense. Why haven't you spoken about this part of your past? Given what you're going through now, it seems significant. Raul's expression grew guarded. My decision to leave law enforcement was personal. It was a painful chapter, and it's not something I discuss lightly. Angela's gaze softened slightly. What happened, Raul? People would want to understand. This could add a powerful layer to your story. He looked down, choosing his words carefully. There were incidents that led me to walk away from that life. Discrimination from within, and my realization that I couldn't bring change from the inside. Angela nodded, sensing the sensitivity of the topic. Did the discrimination you faced back then have anything to do with what you're experiencing now? Raul's jaw tightened, his voice coming out low and steady. It was the same kind of bias, the same walls built on prejudice and power. I left because I thought I could do more for justice on the outside. Angela leaned back, a thoughtful expression on her face. So, this isn't just about last week's incident. It's a continuation of something you've been fighting your whole life. Raul nodded slowly, the weight of his own words settling in his chest. Yes, and that's why I can't walk away this time. Hours after the interview, Raul sat alone in his office, replaying the conversation in his mind. He hadn't intended to reveal his past in law enforcement, but somehow it felt necessary. There was a knock at his door, and Gabriella entered, her face a mixture of concern and curiosity. I just saw your interview, she said quietly, taking a seat across from him. You used to be a police officer? Raul nodded, a faint sadness in his eyes. It was years ago, Gabriella. I thought I could make a difference from the inside. But I was naive. She studied him, a deep empathy in her gaze. What happened? He took a deep breath, his voice rough. I was one of only a few black officers in my precinct. I faced discrimination from my peers, but I kept telling myself I could endure it for the greater good. Then, one night, there was an incident. A fellow officer, someone I thought was a friend, made a decision that cost a young man his life. And when I tried to speak up, they turned on me. Gabriella's eyes widened, her voice a whisper. They tried to silence you? Raoul nodded. They made it clear that if I didn't fall in line, I'd be the one they targeted next. So, I left. I thought maybe if I became a judge, I could still fight for justice, but from a place of safety. Gabriella placed a hand on his arm, her voice filled with quiet conviction. Raoul, you're stronger than you think. And now, maybe sharing this part of your story will make people see why this fight means so much to you. He sighed, looking down. It brings back so many painful memories. I thought I'd moved on, but it's like I'm right back there, feeling helpless. She leaned closer, her tone gentle but firm. But you're not helpless now, Raoul. This time, you're not alone. The next day, the media was ablaze with the revelation about Raoul's past as a police officer. While some outlets highlighted the bravery of his journey, others questioned his motives, painting him as a hypocrite for speaking out now. Raoul's phone rang, and he answered to hear the voice of his former police mentor, Captain Ellis. Raoul, it's been a long time, Ellis greeted him, his voice strained. Yes, it has, Captain, Raoul replied cautiously. I saw the news. You've opened quite the Pandora's box, haven't you? Raoul's tone was clipped. I'm not afraid to speak the truth anymore, Captain. People deserve to know what really goes on. There was a pause, then Ellis spoke, his tone softer. I remember what happened back then, Raoul. I know you tried to do the right thing. Raoul's voice was tinged with bitterness. Then why did you let them push me out? Ellis sighed heavily. I was trying to protect you, Raoul. It was a different time. They would have destroyed your career. And I thought you deserved a chance at a life beyond that mess. Raoul's voice softened slightly. Maybe you were trying to protect me, but it still hurt. And now, I'm facing it all over again. Ellis was silent for a moment, then replied, I respect what you're doing, Raoul, but be careful. This path you're on, it's not going to get easier. Raoul hung up, feeling the weight of his decision pressing down on him. Later that evening, Raoul met with Gabriella, her support grounding him in the midst of the chaos. They were seated at a quiet coffee shop, the hum of conversations around them a comforting backdrop. Raoul, have you thought about what's going to happen when this goes to court? Gabriella asked, her voice filled with concern. He nodded slowly. I've thought of nothing else. They're going to try and discredit me, bring up everything they can to turn the public against me. Gabriella reached out, taking his hand. Then we have to be ready. And remember, people are already supporting you. Your story. It's making people see things they ignored before. Raoul managed a small smile. Maybe, but that doesn't make it any easier. Gabriella's gaze was unwavering. Nothing worth fighting for is easy, Raoul. But you're doing this for a reason. Don't lose sight of that. He squeezed her hand, feeling the strength of her conviction bolster his own. Thank you, Gabriella, for everything. I don't think I could do this without you. She smiled, a warmth in her eyes that made him feel, for the first time in days, that he wasn't alone in this battle. The next day, Raoul was summoned to meet with the police commissioner, a man known for his conservative views and close ties with the force. Raoul entered the commissioner's office, his spine straight and his gaze steady. Judge Mendez, the commissioner, greeted him, his tone cold. I'll get straight to the point. We're not happy about the way you're handling this situation. Raoul raised an eyebrow, his voice calm. By handling, you mean bringing the truth to light? The commissioner's gaze darkened. You're stirring up trouble, Raul. People are beginning to question the integrity of our force. We can't have that. Raul's expression didn't waver. The integrity of the force is exactly what's in question here. This isn't about me. It's about accountability. The commissioner leaned forward, his tone laced with warning. Be careful, Judge. You have a lot to lose. A reputation, a career. It would be a shame to see all of that tarnished. Raul met his gaze, unflinching. The only shame here is a system that tolerates abuse and prejudice. I have nothing to lose that I haven't already lost in my fight for justice. The commissioner's jaw tightened, and Raul stood, knowing he'd said all he needed to say. As he left the office, Raul felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would be grueling, but he'd face it head-on, no matter the cost. Raul Mendez entered the courtroom, the weight of his journey heavier than ever. Facing him were the two officers, Davi and Mauro, both seated at the defense table with steely expressions. Raul's heart pounded as he looked at them. Memories of that humiliating night flooded his mind. Gabriella sat beside him, her presence a steadying force, her gaze unwavering as she met his. As Raul took his seat, the court clerk called, Judge Mendez, please proceed with your testimony. Raul nodded, his voice strong, though a hint of pain lingered beneath. Thank you. I am here today not just to recount the events of that evening, but to make clear the damage caused by systemic abuse. Davi shifted in his seat, his face set in a rigid expression, while Mauro avoided eye contact entirely. Raul continued, his voice gaining strength. That night, I walked into that restaurant, hoping for a peaceful evening, a moment to myself after a long day in the courtroom. But what I faced was a reminder that to some, my accomplishments, my role, none of it mattered. Davi leaned over to his attorney, murmuring something, his expression dismissive. Raul's fists clenched slightly, but he forced himself to stay composed. Gabriella spoke up, her voice carrying a quiet strength. I saw how they treated him. Not just disrespect, but complete dehumanization. As a witness to their actions, I felt ashamed, and I knew it wasn't just Raul who faced this. It's countless others. The defense attorney stood, addressing the judge. Objection. Ms. Gabriella's statement is speculative and overly emotional. The judge looked at Gabriella, but Raul quickly interjected, with all due respect, Your Honor, her testimony is crucial. She saw it firsthand, not just as an employee but as a human being who recognized injustice. The judge allowed her to continue, and Gabriella's gaze moved between Raul and the defense table. When they handcuffed him, it wasn't because of a legitimate threat. It was because of prejudice, plain and simple. Mauro finally looked up, his eyes flickering with something close to regret, but he said nothing. Davi, however, scoffed, shaking his head subtly. The judge nodded at Raul. Thank you, Judge Mendez. You may step down. Raul returned to his seat, his mind spinning, and as he sat down, Gabriella leaned over, her voice a soft whisper. You did well. They heard you. Raul gave her a small nod, but his thoughts remained tangled in the pain and injustice of that night. Later, during a recess, Raul and Gabriella stepped outside, only to be approached by Officer Eduardo, who had been in the courtroom, observing quietly. Judge Mendez, Eduardo began, his voice tentative. I wanted to talk to you. Raul looked at him warily, memories of the last time he trusted a fellow officer resurfacing. Go ahead, officer. Eduardo took a deep breath. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for what happened. I wasn't there that night, but I know Davi and Mauro, and I've seen the way they handle people sometimes. Raul's expression softened slightly, but he remained cautious. Then why come forward now, Eduardo? Eduardo looked down, guilt evident on his face. Because I've stayed silent too long. I thought as long as it didn't affect me, I could just ignore it. But seeing this trial, It made me realize I was part of the problem. Gabriella looked at Raul, her eyes encouraging him to listen. Raul finally nodded, his voice softer. I appreciate your words, Eduardo, but words alone don't change things. Are you willing to testify? Eduardo hesitated, a flash of fear crossing his face. I don't know. The backlash. Raul's gaze sharpened. Think of the backlash I've faced. The personal and public scrutiny, the judgment. If you're serious about wanting change, then help me. Help us make a difference. Eduardo's eyes met Raul's, and after a long silence, he nodded slowly. All right, I'll testify. Raul felt a surge of relief, but kept his expression steady. Then I'll see you back inside. When the trial resumed, Eduardo took the stand, his face pale but determined. His testimony revealed Davi and Moro's history of excessive force complaints, incidents that had been quietly dismissed or downplayed by the department. Raul watched as Davi's face darkened, his anger barely concealed. After Eduardo finished, Davi's attorney called him to the stand. Davi's demeanor was defensive, his tone laced with sarcasm as he responded to questions. Judge Mendez, he began, directing his comment to Raul rather than his attorney. You think you're some hero, right? Standing here, accusing us like you're above it all. Raul met his gaze steadily. This isn't about me being a hero, Officer Davi. It's about accountability. Davi's face twisted with contempt. Accountability? From a man who left the police force to become a judge? You think that erases what you did? The courtroom fell silent, tension mounting as Raul's past was brought to the forefront. Raul's voice was calm but unwavering. Leaving the force was one of the hardest decisions I've ever made, but I did it because I refused to be part of a corrupt system. And standing here today, I can finally fight for the justice that I couldn't back then. Davi laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. You left because you were weak, because you couldn't handle what it takes to be in the field. Gabriella's hand found Raul's, a silent offer of strength. Raul responded, his voice clear and steady. Strength isn't about tolerating injustice, Officer Davi. Strength is standing up against it. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, and the judge called for order. Raul could feel the weight of every gaze on him, but he stood tall, his conviction unshaken. After the trial session ended for the day, Raul and Gabriella exited the courthouse, surrounded by reporters. Microphones and cameras were thrust towards them, questions shouted from every angle. Judge Mendez, do you have any comments on today's proceedings? Raul glanced at Gabriella, who gave him a reassuring nod. He took a deep breath and addressed the crowd. This case isn't just about one night or one incident. It's about a system that allows discrimination and abuse to persist. I am here to ensure that those responsible are held accountable, not just for myself but for everyone who has ever faced injustice. Gabriella added, her voice firm, we won't stop until there's change. This isn't just Raul's fight. It's a fight for everyone. The reporters continued to press them with questions, but Raul and Gabriella walked away, side by side, a quiet determination in their steps. That evening, Raul and Gabriella sat together in his office, the weight of the day hanging between them. Gabriella broke the silence, her voice soft. Do you ever regret it, Raul? Taking this all on? Raul looked at her, his expression thoughtful. Sometimes. But then I remember why I'm doing it. For all the people who feel they don't have a voice. And for myself, to finally find peace. Gabriella's gaze was filled with admiration. You've come so far, Raul. And whether you win this case or not, you've already made a difference. He nodded, a faint smile on his face. Maybe. But there's still a long way to go. They sat in silence for a while, the city lights twinkling outside, a reminder of the countless lives affected by the fight they were waging. For the first time in a long time, Raul felt a glimmer of hope. The courtroom was packed, tension thick in the air as Raul Mendez took his place, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Journalists filled the benches, their pens poised to capture every word, and at the defense table, Davi and Morrow sat stone-faced, their attorneys whispering furiously beside them. Gabriella was at Raoul's side, her support an unwavering presence that gave him strength. As the judge entered, the room fell silent. Raoul's heart pounded, each beat a reminder of the fight he had endured to reach this moment. The judge cleared his throat and addressed the court. Today, we are here not only to determine accountability, but to recognize the patterns that allow prejudice to persist within institutions meant to protect us. The defense attorney stood, his voice calm but forceful. Your Honor, my clients maintain that they acted within their rights. They have served this city with dedication and argue that this was a case of unfortunate misunderstanding, not malicious intent. Raoul couldn't help but glance at Davi, whose expression remained defiant. Morrow, on the other hand, avoided eye contact, his face etched with something close to regret. Raoul leaned closer to Gabriella, whispering, "He's wavering. He knows what they did was wrong." Gabriella nodded. "Maybe he'll have the courage to admit it. But whatever happens, Raoul, you've already made a difference. People are listening." The judge turned to Raoul's attorney. "Mr. Chun, your closing arguments." Anthony Chun rose, his expression focused. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the court, this case is not about one incident. It's about a system that allows those in power to wield it without accountability. Judge Mendez, a man who has dedicated his life to justice, was treated like a criminal because of his appearance. We must ask ourselves what kind of world we want to live in." Anthony's words hung in the air, and Raoul felt a surge of gratitude for his attorney's unwavering commitment. He glanced at Gabriella, her eyes glistening as she held his gaze. When the judge called for a recess before delivering the verdict, Raoul and Gabriella stepped outside into the corridor, both of them silent, each absorbed in the gravity of the moment. As they leaned against the wall, Davi approached them, his face twisted in anger. "So, this is what you wanted, Mendez? To ruin our lives, our careers?" Raoul's expression was calm, though his eyes burned with a quiet fury. "I didn't ruin anything, Davi. You did that yourself the moment you chose to abuse your power." Davi's voice rose, his tone laced with contempt. "You think you're some kind of hero? You're just another guy trying to make himself look good." Gabriella stepped forward, her voice cutting through Davi's anger. "He's standing up for himself, for everyone who's ever faced what he did. And if you can't see that, it says more about you than it does about him." Davi opened his mouth to retort, but before he could speak, Morrow stepped forward, his voice low. "Davi, that's enough." Davi turned, surprise evident on his face. "You're siding with him now?" Morrow looked away, a shadow of shame crossing his features. "I'm saying we crossed a line. And maybe it's time to admit it." Davi scoffed, shaking his head in disgust. "You've lost it." With that, he stormed off, leaving Morrow standing there, his gaze finally meeting Raoul's. "Judge Mendez, I'm sorry. I know it doesn't change anything, but I needed to say it." Raoul's voice softened, though his resolve remained firm. "It's a start, Morrow. Recognizing the wrong is the first step toward change." Morrow nodded, then turned and walked away, leaving Raoul and Gabriella alone in the corridor, the weight of the moment settling over them. Back in the courtroom, the judge re-entered, and everyone took their seats. The silence was almost suffocating as he cleared his throat, preparing to read the verdict. After careful consideration of the evidence, the testimonies, and the context of this case, I find officers Davi and Morrow guilty of misconduct and racial profiling. However, instead of a prison sentence, I am ordering both officers to participate in an extensive re-education and sensitivity training program and suspending them from active duty. A collective murmur rippled through the room, some people dissatisfied with the leniency, others relieved that accountability had been acknowledged. Raoul felt a mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and an aching sense of unfinished work. The judge's gaze softened as he looked at Raul. "Judge Mendez, thank you for your courage in bringing this issue to light. May your example serve as a reminder that justice is a pursuit, not just an end." Raul nodded, gratitude filling him as he glanced over at Gabriela, who smiled, her pride evident. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered, supporters and reporters alike. Raul and Gabriela stood together as Anthony stepped forward to address the press. "Today's verdict marks a step toward change," Anthony declared, his voice carrying across the crowd. "It's not a perfect outcome, but it's a message that prejudice and misuse of authority will not go unchallenged." Reporters surged forward, bombarding Raul with questions. One young journalist managed to push her way to the front. "Judge Mendez, do you think this verdict will truly make a difference?" Raul paused, choosing his words carefully. "Change doesn't happen overnight, but I believe every act of accountability brings us closer to the world we want to live in. This verdict isn't the end of the fight. It's a beginning." Gabriela squeezed his arm, and he turned to her, gratitude and warmth in his gaze. "We've started something important, Gabriela. Thank you for standing by me." She smiled, her eyes shining. "I wouldn't be anywhere else." That evening, Raul and Gabriela returned to his office, the weight of the day slowly lifting as they shared a quiet moment of reflection. "So, what now?" Gabriela asked, settling into the chair across from him. Raul leaned back, a thoughtful smile on his face. "Now, we continue the work. This was one case, but there are countless others. People need to know they don't have to face it alone." Gabriela nodded, her voice soft but resolute. "You've inspired so many, Raul, including me." He met her gaze, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. "I couldn't have done it without you, Gabriela. Your strength, your support. It kept me going when I wanted to give up." They sat in comfortable silence, the city lights casting a soft glow through the office window. For the first time in a long time, Raul felt at peace, knowing he had faced his past and emerged stronger. As they looked out at the city, Gabriela spoke, her voice filled with hope. "Maybe one day, we won't need to fight so hard for justice. Maybe one day it will be the norm." Raul nodded, a gentle smile on his lips. "Until then, we'll keep pushing, one step at a time."